Chapter 10. Dungeon Crawl into the Catacombs. Forcing himself, Thistlethorn placed his hand on the doorknob, feeling a cold sensation that stung his hand. This happened to be the third time that he had taken hold of the handle. The other 2 times he had instinctively pulled back his hand when he had felt the cold sting. He could not back out of opening this door, because, according to the Myris, this was the only door that led to the room with the mirror of the 2 walls. The handle turned, and the faint snap of the releasing latch could be heard by both of the little men. The door started to open. Nevertheless, something on the other side of the door resisted Thistlethorn's push. It did not feel like a barricade or a creature, it was something else. It took Thistlethorn a long moment to figure it out. "There is a wind blowing on the other side." Thistlethorn spoke while he pushed, the wood of the door straining against his arms. "Help me out." Brox pushed with one hand and held the torch in the other hand. When they got the door halfway open, a strong gust of wind completely blew out the torch. Immediately following that, the wind let up for a moment, and the door flew open, causing them to lose their balance and fall down, tumbling into the room. A quick gale of wind slammed the door shut behind them. The gnome and shortling both moved into action to light up the room. Thistlethorn pulled out the elven blade, giving a faint blue glow, and Brox used some druidic magic to create a burning candle. The candle was shaped like an oak tree, but instead of having one burning flame at the top, it had several burning leaves that made up many flames, giving off twice as much light as a torch. Even though it only burned a few moments, it did the job that Brox had hoped for, lighting up the room very effectively. After seeing no monsters or other immediate hazards, Thistlethorn said, well. He glanced around the room, looking at 4 stone walls and a stone ceiling, all of which were nondescript, being block chiseled and polished smooth. Then his eyes went to the floor. "I know that the bard, Mark the versifier, and that the magic mirror, the Myris, both said that this room was filled with silver, but this is not what I expected." Indeed. The 2 little men had been told twice that the room was filled with silver. Now, right in front of them shimmered a pool filled to the top with silver, but it was not silver coins or silver ingots. Quicksilver. Brox laughed. A pool filled with quicksilver. Thistlethorn shook his head in disbelief. "I do not know what to think. I wonder how deep it is. Do you have any idea?" Both knew that question was very valid. If the pool had been filled with water, they would have been able to make an intelligent guess as to the depth. But the quicksilver's surface showed a perfect mirror finish. "It could be an inch deep or 10 feet deep," noted Brox. The shortling started to look around for a stick or something to place into the mercury, but he only found a good-sized rock which he threw into the pool. He expected the rock to sink, but to his surprise it floated. They had to backtrack a long way, all the way back to the weapons training room, to find a stick that would allow them to determine the depth of the pool. Sticker gave them a cracked stick that once served as the blade of a greatsword, being a generous 5.5 feet long. From this cracked stick, they determined that the pool of mercury sank 3 feet deep. "I should suppose," said Thistlethorn, deadpanning, "that you wouldn't want to dive in and find the door." Brox, deadpanning himself, replied, "Oh, yes, I have always wanted to go swimming in a pool full of toxic mercury. I'd better do it now. I doubt that I will ever find a pool like this in Rustic Haven." Brox started to prod the bottom of the pool, looking for something. The mercury stirred about as easily as a bucket of cold honey on a frosty winter morning. The blade of the greatsword barely even churned the liquid as it strained against the mass and viscosity of the liquid metal, almost snapping the stick in the process. "I think I found the door." Brox handed the cracked stick to Thistlethorn. "See what you think." Thistlethorn pushed the stick across the bottom of the pool in the same area, a task he found quite difficult, until he felt the blade of the wooden greatsword hit something. "I am guessing that is some type of door handle." Thistlethorn looked at Brox. "Any idea how to get it open? If we open it, maybe the quicksilver will drain down." A stern, challenging look crossed Brox's face. "No idea, but we'd better find a solution of what to do. Otherwise, we will start to suffer from mercury poisoning and get the shakes." As an afterthought, he added, "We could end up being as mad as a hatter." Thistlethorn pulled the stick out and dropped it next to the edge of the pool. They both walked over to the wall and leaned up against it. They just stood there, looking at the four walls, ceiling, floor, pool of quicksilver, and the rock. For a long time, Thistlethorn just looked at the rock he had thrown in. And he looked at it, and looked at it, and looked at it. "Brox," said Thistlethorn, his voice a whisper. "Do you notice that the rock is moving?" "What?" Brox watched in silence for a moment. "You're right. It is moving." "And what does that tell you?" "Since the door we came in is closed, there are no crosswinds that are making the rock move. Therefore, the mercury is being circulated somehow." Before he finished, Thistlethorn moved back to the edge of the mercury pool with the stick in his hand. He began dragging it around, prodding the bottom of the pool. He found a hole. "Ah, ha!" cried out Thistlethorn as he crammed the blade into the hole. Immediately, they both noticed that the mercury level started to rise. He pulled the blade out of the hole. "That must be the drain." Thistlethorn searched the bottom of the pool again until he found another hole. He crammed the cracked blade into it. "Let's see what that does." The pool started to drain, about 2 inches per minute. In less than 20 minutes, the entire pool was drained, only small beads of quicksilver could be found. In the center of the pool, they saw a rust-free iron trapdoor with 2 hinges and an odd-looking crank handle shaped in the form of a slumped-over cloaked hunchback, a broken smile of jagged teeth peering out from under the hood. After Thistlethorn checked the trapdoor for traps, Brox cranked the handle twice and pulled the trapdoor open. Both of them had expected the trapdoor to either lead to a flight of stairs down or a ladder. Instead, they saw a hole about 20 feet deep. Thistlethorn looked intently for handholds or even notches in the stone wall that would make scaling it easy. The only thing that they saw was a door about halfway down. That is to say, a door 10 feet down in the 20-foot deep hole. "I don't see any way of getting down there," observed Brox. "I guess that we can use a rope and climb down." Thistlethorn shook his head. "I don't know if that is necessary." "What do you mean?" Thistlethorn pointed down. "Look at the door." Brox complied. "Now," continued the shortling, "take a couple of steps to the right and keep looking at the door while you do so." Again, Brox complied. After taking the second step, he raised an eyebrow as he recognized something out of the ordinary. "It's like a mirage. The door wavers slightly when I take a step." He took a few more steps to see the mirage effect. "Why is that?" "It's the byproduct of a spell called Syrup Air." Thistlethorn took an iron spike out of his backpack and tossed it into the hole. The spike fell down, but very slowly, perhaps with the same speed if it had been thrown into a bucket full of syrup. It was nearly half a minute before the iron spike hit the bottom. "Syrup Air," said Brox, looking at his friend. "I have never even heard of that spell. Where did you learn it?" Thistlethorn shrugged. "When I went exploring the Kiltmon dungeon, nestled in the hills of the Three Seasons, I came across this same type of situation. The Magus Dalsanio, who was one of the members of my party, explained how to tell that a syrup air spell was in effect. She had me walk around and see the mirage the same way I had you walk around. At that time, I saw a mirage. The only difference being, I wasn't looking at a door but a lever that needed to be pulled." Brox started to ask Thistlethorn what needed to be done next, when the shortling simply stepped into the hole and began to sink down. Due to the viscosity of the syrup air, his descent did not prove completely straight down. Therefore, he would occasionally have to push off one of the walls to keep himself in an upright position. When he reached the door, he just grabbed the door handle and opened the door, stepping into the room beyond. Brox stood at the top of the hole, watching the other. When Thistlethorn entered the room beyond the door, he could see the shortling speaking, but he could not hear him. Apparently, sound did not travel very well through syrup air. Thistlethorn followed up whatever he had said with a wave to come down. Brox followed Thistlethorn's example and simply stepped into the hole. This produced an unexpected result. Shortlings have exceptional dexterity to the place that people say, throw a shortling off a balcony, and he will land on his feet like a cat, or shortlings can skip across a tightrope, or have you ever seen a shortling slip on ice? With his exceptional dexterity, Thistlethorn had easily been able to sink down in an upright position, using the walls to correct any minor imbalances. Brox, on the other hand, was a gnome. Whereas gnomes are not known to be clumsy, they are not known for having exceptional dexterity. Therefore, Brox just sort of rolled, tumbled, and twisted as he fell through the syrup air. Brox continued his uncontrolled descent, looking like a rag doll tossed out of a high window. He would have fallen all the way to the bottom of the hole had it not been for Thistlethorn, who reached out and grabbed an upside-down Brox by the boot, pulling him into the room. Whereas Thistlethorn had just stepped into the room as normal as could be, Brox entered the room with a whump, landing on his back. He hit the ground hard enough to stun him for a very brief moment. When he came around and opened his eyes, he could see Thistlethorn peering down at him, first with a deep look of concern and then a wide grin. "That was an interesting way to come down," said Thistlethorn as he helped the other stand up. "Not quite as graceful as a shortling," noted Brox after standing up. "I guess it must be true what they say about shortlings and cats always landing on their feet." Thistlethorn, having heard such sayings too many times, changed the subject. "As you can see, there is a full-length mirror on each of these two walls." He pointed left and right. "I have no idea which one is the teleportation mirror. What do you think?" Brox studied the mirrors. Each mirror went floor to ceiling and wall to wall, covering a generous 200 square feet each. The gnome also noticed that the mirrors were not chipped, cracked, or in any other way damaged. In fact, they were even smudge-free, a condition he found very unusual, especially when considering the size of the mirrors. He looked around the rest of the room, noting the black granite stonework that had been polished to a light sheen. The only thing out of the ordinary was a patchwork mosaic painted onto the floor. The mosaic looked nondescript in nature, but it showed figures, perhaps elves, lined up in a straight line. One of them had a long bow. It was slung over the carrier's shoulder in such a way as to point directly backwards. The mural showed the individuals lined up, then the mural changed into them walking backwards, and finally it showed them all stepping backwards into the mirror. "Which mirror do you think is the one we need to walk into?" Brox glanced back and forth between the mirrors on the opposite walls. Thistlethorn did not look at the mirror but at the floor. "Right here." He pointed to a thin cut in the floor. "You can see here that this split in the rock isn't due to age, but it is the willful result of a chisel tip. There are 4 of them here about a span wide and 2 strides apart. I think that we need to line up on the chisel marks and face that way." He pointed to the right. "And walk that way." He pointed to the left. "Do you think that we need to say any magic words to make it work?" "No, the bard didn't say so. I guess we can try it and see how it works." Before stepping on the line chiseled into the floor, they both could see themselves in the mirrors as normal. However, after standing on the line for a moment, they no longer saw themselves as normal but as a backward, inverted image. In other words, they looked like they were standing on the ceiling and looking at their backpacks, as opposed to their faces. Moreover, as they started walking backwards, they appeared to be getting larger in the mirror that they walked away from. While turning this strange phenomenon over in their mind, they found themselves stepping into the opposite mirror, the glass bending and warping around them like water, swallowing them up in a sudden crack. "And into the looking glass we go," said Brox in a quiet voice. ******. Brox and Thistlethorn stepped backwards, not only entering a mirror, but in the same step, exiting another mirror. In one moment they exited the Cross-Down world and entered the realm of Seju, basically traveling from one dungeon to another dungeon. They found themselves in a chamber that looked virtually identical to the chamber they had just left, complete with the 2 mirrors on the opposite walls and a mural on the floor, but instead of elvish-looking figures in the painting, they were orcish-looking. "I am guessing," noted Thistlethorn, "that this is a one-way trip. When we want to leave, we will have to find another way back." "Why do you say that?" Brox did not even remotely like the idea of being trapped in this place without a method of escape. "Well," Thistlethorn pointed, The mirror on that side has a crack from one end to the other. I am guessing that would nullify the magic that would let the teleportation work the opposite direction. The gnome shook his head. That may well be. That may well be. Brox let the thought trail off. I guess that you had better lead the way. There's a door over there. The two little men found themselves in a complex series of catacombs that existed in the lowest part of the dungeon. Moreover, the catacombs were not like typical dungeons with rooms and chambers suitably connected by corridors. No, the catacombs were a gallery of coffins, sarcophagi, and mostly niches in the wall. They could not see into the coffins and sarcophagi, but the niches were open, and they could see the dusty, brittle, skeletal remains of men, elves, dwarfs, and on occasion, gnomes and shortlings. The entire catacombs formed an enormous maze, a haggard, dismal layout of twists, turns, and dead ends. Whether this had been an intentional design or a byproduct of centuries of construction could not be told. The knowledge of wandering in the midst of so many of the dead instilled fright into both of them. Yet, worse than this, there existed the silence and the utter dead sound of complete emptiness. That chilled them to the bone. Both of them felt like running, but a sense of fear gripped them so much that they could only take small, mouse-like steps of quiet movement. Several minutes later, the two of them found themselves at the top of a set of stone stairs that terminated with a pair of arched doors made of granite. Each door, smoothly polished, had a single brass ring used to pull it open. Brox looked for runes or glyphs of guarding that might trigger spell traps like brittle ice storm or back arc lightning, or curses like blindness or deafness. The only writing he found was the name of the stonemason who had constructed the doors. Brigman 6. 392. Brox read the words in a hushed undertone. Sounds dwarven, noted Thistlethorn. They had figured that it would take both of their combined strengths to open one of the doors, but the door opened with even greater ease than the door to Brox's burrow, a sure sign of the excellent dwarven craftsmanship done centuries ago. The two of them stepped into the room beyond the stone doors. Well, this is different, said Brox, looking around the room. Why do you say that? Thistlethorn kept the elven blade out in front of him. I am not sure what kind of room I would normally expect sitting next to catacombs full of crypts, but it would not be a room designed for royalty. The room did look like it had been designed for royalty, even though everything looked old, worn, and corroded. Metallic coats of arms were rusty and chipped. Tapestries of elegant scenes of hunting lodges in the forest, unicorns by ponds, dwarven warriors standing in perfect ranks with pickaxes raised, and many more, were all faded, frayed, and full of moth-eaten holes. They saw one other thing of note in the chamber, a throne. The throne consisted of tarnished silver and scratched gold. All of this had been framed around rotting, splintering, cracked wood. On the throne rested a royal blue cushion, so worn through that only threads and wool stuffing remained. Concerning the size of the throne, it was very little. The throne looks like it would be the right size for a gnome king or a shortling king, said Brox, obviously pleased with the small throne. Or, perhaps, started Thistlethorn, it would be the right size for a dwarf king, finished a deep voice. Both of them spun to the right to see a coarse-looking dwarf with an unsightly disheveled beard that split unevenly into knots and jagged edges. His skin tone was not a dark peach color like most dwarfs, but a sickly gray that reminded Brox of a large rock that sat in the middle of Farmer Jensenberry's pumpkin garden back in Rustic Haven. The dwarf sported a battered, tattered, regal robe and wore a bent iron crown. Moreover, he carried a fragment of a decorated scepter in his left hand and held a huge snake, over 24 feet long, in his right hand. The Dwarf King has returned, thundered the dwarf, his voice echoing in dull booms. What kind of dwarf has grey skin and carries a snake? Asked Thistlethorn in a hushed tone to Brox. That's no ordinary dwarf. Brox's voice sounded very serious and had a hint of trepidation in it. He has joined the ranks of the undead. That snake is a necroanaconda. The poison in its fangs isn't a hemotoxin or even a neurotoxin. It's called a necrotoxin. If you get bitten, the poison will spread through your body, consuming you and turning you into an undead creature, which is probably what happened to the dwarf. The only good news is that it can only bite once per full moon. Therefore, it won't be able to get us both." The dwarf made a deep, guttural laugh, mocking the words of Brox. He tossed the snake through the air at them, and it went spinning sideways, landing on the ground at Thistlethorn's feet. The shortling responded by swinging the magic sword at the creature, but the creature snapped and twisted with a rapid side-winding movement, dodging the tip of the elven blade. Brox had no idea how to fight a necro-anaconda, but he instinctively began to cast a simple druidic spell that he used back home to make snakes leave his garden. Don't hide behind the rock. Don't even pause or stop. Go to the white picket fence. Then remove yourself hence. The necro-anaconda slowed down a little, acting confused. The spell had been designed for living snakes, but it still had some minor effect upon the necro-anaconda. In response, the undead dwarf spoke in a sharp barking sound, commanding the snake to coil up and strike. The snake began to comply, coiling itself in a quick spin. Therefore, Brox added one more phrase to his spell, a phrase he only used on very rare occasions to drive large pit vipers and pythons from his garden. Hissing forked tongue of the hollow. Go the way I said to follow. While casting this last part of the enchantment, he held his left forearm and hand parallel to the ground and his right arm behind his left forearm, perpendicular to the ground, his hand and fingers bent to look like a snake head. Also, his right forearm and hand moved back and forth in a soft, smooth, swaying motion. The snake saw this and began to sway back and forth, too, uncoiling its body at the same time. When fully uncoiled, it began to slither away. The undead dwarf became enraged at this turn of events. Leaping toward the necro-anaconda, he picked it up behind the head and began to shake it violently. The snake retaliated, instinctively trying to strike the undead dwarf king and wrap its body around the other, constricting in a death squeeze. "Let's get out of here while they are fighting each other," said Brox, leading the way to a door just behind the undead dwarf king. After passing through the door, Thistlethorn pulled it shut behind them, spiking it closed with an iron spike for good measure. He opened another door that led into a corridor filled with a wet, sticky, grey haze that moved in slow twists and formed shapes that they could almost discern. They started moving, silently walking through a maze of never-ending passages, sometimes stopping and doubling back when they came to a dead end. Once they stopped, thinking that they had heard footfalls, but they continued on when they decided that it had only been the echo of dripping water coming from a side corridor. At the top of a stairwell, they reached a rough stone door that was obviously barred closed. Usually, when adventuring through forgotten dungeons, Thistlethorn had found himself on the wrong side of a locked door. He was very pleased that this time he was on the right side of the locked door. As he started to slide the bar over and unlock the door, a warning went up in the back of his mind. Perhaps, this door is actually locking something in on the other side. His words trailed off. Brox did not respond immediately. Instead, he pulled out a little dusting brush that every gnome, experienced in the science of alchemy, carried. He brushed the dust off a stone pedestal that sat next to the door. Both of them recoiled in horror when they saw that the pedestal had chiseled into it the script of the Congress of Blarks, that is to say, the written language called the Canon of Fevers. "I don't have any of my books to help me to interpret this," said Brox, shaking his head. "Can you read any of it?" "Sure." Brox nodded his head slowly. "The first word says, beware. An. That's the only word I am sure of." Brox smirked. Ironically, it was the first word that C.T. Premox, Magnus of Erudition, made me memorize from the Canon of Fevers. I can still remember him saying, "You never know when knowing such a word will come in handy." He was holding an unrolled scroll that had an elaborate drawing of 4 elementals of earth, fire, air, and water and their corresponding colors of green, red, yellow, and blue. He shrugged. "I'm sorry, but I can't read any more." Thistlethorn, being a rogue, had training in reading a variety of languages and runes. However, it did not include more than rudimentary training in ancient languages, and he did not feel even remotely confident that he could read any of the script on the stone pedestal. "Let's see what we have here," said the shortling. He ran his finger over the words, looking for any fragments that he understood or could discern. About 2/3 of the way through the text, he stopped. I think. He paused. I think this word is banshee. Banshee. Brox's voice went dry by the time he spoke the second syllable. Almost positive. Brox recovered himself a bit. You mean that there is a banshee on the other side of this door? That would be my guess. What about the rest of the text? What does it say? Thistlethorn finished trying to read the rest, but he understood nothing else. I'm afraid that's it. You wouldn't happen to know the read languages spell or have a scroll with such a spell on it? Brox shook his head. That's not part of my repertoire, and I do not have such a scroll. What do you think the full text says? I would venture to say that it tells how to easily bypass the banshee. Humph. Since we can't read it, I guess we will have to bypass it through brute force. The gnome's voice resounded determination. Thistlethorn slid over the bar, unlocking the door. He pulled the door open, revealing a narrow corridor that proved void of any decor or doors, fading away into total darkness. The walls here were not made out of rock, but a dry, flaky clay. The ceiling rose in a haphazard serrated cut, disappearing out of sight. There was something about this passageway that made them feel as though they were heading down a tunnel that would eventually disappear and dissolve into nothing. Even so, the two pressed on into the gloom, giving no signs of retreating. Without warning, a chilling noise began to fluctuate in high-pitched screams that seemed to be coming from every direction at once. The sharpness of the sound caused stinging pain, not pain in the ears, but pain in the bones, forcing them to swoon, stagger, and stumble. The force of the banshee's call rolled over and around them like a cascading waterfall, dumping its heavy weight of water on top of jutting rocks below. The sound's terrifying effect began to erode their willpower to go on, causing them to just want to fall down and give up. They started to yell to one another to keep moving, but their voices were drowned out by the banshee's call. When one of them would hit the ground and quit fighting the need to move on, the other would push, pull, or even kick the other to get him back into motion. The banshee's call rose to a shriek, forcing physical numbness into their mortal bodies, sending through them jolts of sulky, loathsome, undisguised terror. This latter attack almost did them in as they were. Now struggling both physically and mentally against the banshee's icy, inflexible, efficient attack. Wave after wave shredded them internally, forcing them to falter between a crawl and a stumbling walk. As quickly as it had begun, it ended. Brox found himself lying on the floor of a different corridor, one hewn out of rock and not clay. He looked back the way they both had come, and he saw Thistlethorn shutting a door that now served as a physical barrier between them and the banshee. Brox did not remember the last few steps and guessed that his friend had dragged him out of the lair of the banshee. When he collected his wits about him, he sat up and discovered that he was fully intact, even though completely covered with clay dust. In the distance, he could hear the banshee's call go from a scream to a buzzing sound which finally retreated into silence. Even though they knew that they were safe from the banshee, they wasted no time putting distance between them and the location of the dire nightmare. Thistlethorn continued to lead the way, taking turns down ancient corridors and opening aged doors. Let's use this, said Thistlethorn, pointing to what looked like, at least to Brox, a metal feeding trough with wheels. We can move faster this way. Brox shook his head. I don't even know what that is, much less desire to use it as a mode of transportation. It's called a mine cart. Thistlethorn tried to make sure that he was not sounding sarcastic. We can roll through the cave in it. Brox peered at the rusty iron bucket, looking for a way to steer it. Well, I don't see any reins or a helm to control it. Thistlethorn chuckled at Brox's lack of knowledge on mine carts. It rolls on tracks, so you don't steer it in a conventional way. He paused, trying to think how to explain his next point. If the tracks split, you can take the alternate track by leaning to the left or to the right. He shrugged, adding, at least that's how the millabouts did it. Millabouts? Brox scoffed. Then this should be dull. After a little more encouragement from Thistlethorn, Brox climbed into the mine cart. Almost immediately, they found themselves barreling downhill at speeds faster than a horse gallops. After a few moments of this, Brox hunkered down, feeling terrible, what best could be described as seasickness. Thistlethorn was undaunted. In fact, he was standing up in the front of the mine cart yelling, "Port," and "Starboard," giving Brox a clear signal as to which direction to lean, making the cart veer to the left or right at various intersections. Eventually, the mine cart slowed down as the tracks leveled out, grinding to a stop just a couple of feet from a dead end. After exiting the mine cart, Brox took a long moment to compose himself. They passed into a darkened room. Immediately, the shortling held up his hand, indicating that they should halt. They found themselves standing in the midst of row upon row of stone statues resembling orcs, goblins, hobgoblins, bugbears, and gnolls, each in full poses of attack, armed with miscellaneous weapons, and clad in various types of armor. At the far end of this room, they saw an iron portcullis in the midst of a churning grey mist. A silent hush passed between them like a dying wind on a calm summer's eve. Despite the fact that they both moved as quietly as possible, their footfalls echoed between the stone statues of the creatures of chaos. The floor here looked clean and dust-free, but it felt particularly cold, a cold that had the ability to pull the heat down and out of them, leaving them shaking from the chill. They both knew that something waited for them up ahead, something that had the ability to wait decades or even centuries for the unwary. As Brox moved from one end of the chamber to the other, he thought that he saw, out of the corner of his eye, the stone statues animating and preparing to launch an attack. But, whenever he looked right at them, they were as still and as lifeless as any other statue. Moreover, he thought that he saw the walls closing in on them and the ceiling collapsing upon them. But when he took a moment to stare at them, they were in the exact position they had always been in. When they made it to the opposite end, Thistlethorn motioned that he wanted to examine a pool off to the right. The pool was circular in nature and ringed with double-baked bricks of a reddish color. Cracks in the mortar had been repaired with a pasty sand known as cretum, a poor-quality cement. The pool did not have water, but a black, mushy glop that reminded Brox of bubbling tar used to meld thatched roofing segments together. From high above, a large drop of the strange substance fell into the pool, causing the smooth surface to ripple like a slow wave, dissipating its energy when it reached the outer edge. The exhausted gnome and shortling gazed into the pool, wishing for a pool of chilled water in which they could place their weary feet. Mechanically, they turned toward the gaping hole, their eyes scanning the portcullis that barred their entry. Thistlethorn found a wheel and spindle that had a series of chains and pulleys attached to it to raise and lower the portcullis. Pulling the lever that released the brake on the spindle, Thistlethorn began to turn the wheel and raise the portcullis. He did not bother to raise it all the way up or even to raise it high enough for them to walk under. He only gave it a good 3 cranks, moving it just high enough for them to crawl under. They passed under the portcullis and through the grey mist, finding themselves in a torture chamber. They took a moment to examine the room, noting branding. Irons, pressing boards, a U-rack, pillories, a nesting box, a ducking stool with an attached water tank, and the typical assortment of barbed chains, whips, and shackles. They also saw a few other items that were on the fatal side: an iron maiden, a gallows, a mangonel that could fire an individual several hundred yards. There was no outside to fire the mangonel, so they assumed that the victim would be shot across the torture chamber and just hit the stone wall, and even jagged tooth saws for drawing and quartering. Like their encounter with the Banshee, they found themselves under attack without warning. A sudden shadow detached from the ceiling and dropped down upon those who intruded into its lair. A grotesque monster, consisting of a massive cephalothorax and abdomen for a body, the thing thought only of its next meal. The creature sported many eyes that lined up in 2 rows of 4 and rotated rapidly to get a fix on Brox and Thistlethorn. Located beneath 2 chelicerae, there appeared a macabre mouth flanked by a pair of pedipalps that sliced and crushed the monster's prey before being devoured. The most notable feature of this megalomorph was its 8 legs, each consisting of 7 segments with the last segment of every one ending in a scapula and 3 claws. "Monstrous spider," yelled Thistlethorn in warning as he noted the descending shadow. Both Brox and Thistlethorn jumped to the side as the massive creature's claws tried to dig into them. "Brox!" Thistlethorn started to shout, but he soon found himself under attack. The monstrous spider shot a stream of silk at the shortling, strewing him with a sticky strand. Thistlethorn held up his arm defensively and absorbed most of this web as it wrapped around his hand and wrist. He produced a dagger in his other hand and proceeded to cut the web, freeing himself with 4 quick slashes. The monstrous spider turned and shot a web at Brox, enveloping him completely before the gnome could react. Triumphant in ensnaring a prey, the Mygalomorph moved to inject the trapped Brox with a debilitating poison that first caused paralysis and then led to a comatose state. As the creature charged Brox, Thistlethorn took the dagger in his hand and, with a flick of his wrist, sent it sailing across the room where it struck the monstrous spider in one of its 8 eyes, sinking all the way down to the handguard on the dagger. With 2 more flicks of his wrist, the shortling sent 2 more daggers at the giant arachnid. The first one bounced harmlessly off one of its legs, but the other wedged itself neatly between cephalothorax and abdomen, causing a brown viscous substance to ooze out. Out of daggers, Thistlethorn charged the monstrous spider before it could inject some poison into his friend. The Mygalomorph, as if to take up an unspoken challenge, turned and charged the shortling. Just as the two were about to collide, Thistlethorn dropped to the ground, forming a ball to roll underneath the juggernaut. The monstrous spider, however, stopped completely, reared up, and fell on Thistlethorn to crush the life out of him. Thistlethorn had expected to roll completely underneath his foe, but it had stopped, and he had only rolled part way under the cephalothorax. At the last moment, he managed to pull the magic sword out and hold it straight up. The full weight of the monstrous spider crashed down on the elven blade, causing the creature to rip open and spray a hot, caustic, brown blood everywhere. Geysers of the glop gushed ubiquitously, causing a heavy glob to fall squarely on the shortling, burning through his leather armor in hissing jets. "Arg!" yelled Thistlethorn as he twisted in the blazing pain of the monstrous spider's liquid innards. Releasing his grip on the magic sword, the shortling scurried as fast as he could out from underneath the Mygalomorph, not just to escape the stinging hot caustic blood, but to escape the crushing weight of the creature, for as the creature's blood poured out, its blood pressure dropped, causing its legs to curl up underneath it, making it fall on Thistlethorn. Under the threat of being crushed to death, he had to leave the magic sword, a grand elven blade of distinction and eminence. Picking up the dagger that had bounced off of the monstrous spider, he ran over to Brox to cut him free. "Thanks," said Brox. Thistlethorn started to reply, but the gnome cut him off. "There are more of those nightmares up there." The gnome pointed at 3 more. "Nevertheless, this will keep them busy." The gnome pulled out a flask of oil, and Thistlethorn, knowing what the other was up to, pulled out a torch, snapping his fingers to produce a flame. This ability to produce a flame by snapping one's fingers has long been a guarded secret among a select few rogues. He ignited the torch. Brox threw the flask of oil at the ceiling, where it shattered and soaked the webs. Thistlethorn followed this up by throwing the torch into the oil-drenched webs, igniting the flammable liquid, burning the webs, and sending strands of fire toward the other Mygalomorphs as the monstrous spider's lair caught fire. Brox and Thistlethorn found themselves standing at the bottom of a long set of stairs consisting of scores of cracked, chipped, and fragmented steps all covered with spots and smudges and specks and splotches of a yellow-brown mold. At the top, beyond an open archway, blazed a light. It was not the kind of light one would expect in the realm of Seju. That is to say, it was not some scary, hideous, foreboding light, but rather a glowing, cheerful, warm light that. In fact, it looked like the flickering light that originated from the fireplace in a burrow. Moreover, they heard a strange sound drifting down from the 100+ stairs. Yes, a very strange sound. Laughter? Brox raised an eyebrow. Indeed. It sounds like people laughing in the midst of generous conversation. Like, the dining area of an inn. Thistlethorn leaned up against the side of the grey stone wall at the bottom of the stairs. Now, what kind of dungeon has an inn at the top of a stairwell? Perhaps it's not an inn. Maybe it's an elaborate illusion, such as the kind that comes from the spell during Illusory, a favorite spell among illusionists to make people feel comfortable. "Should we go up?" asked Thistlethorn, still leaning against the wall. "I would think so. But how will we be able to tell the difference between an illusion and the real thing?" Brox smiled. Well, I am a gnome, and as you know, gnomes have a knack for telling the difference between such illusions and the real thing. Thistlethorn nodded in acceptance, but frowned when Brox tacked on the words, under normal circumstances. When they reached the top of the stairs, they found precisely what they thought they would find. Well, inquired Thistlethorn, is it an illusion? I don't think so. The two of them hid at the edge of the archway and spoke in hushed voices. That looks like real people, eating real food, telling real stories, sitting on real benches at real tables. It was certainly the type of scene that Thistlethorn had seen hundreds of times at different places, including Slashy Decanter, Three Twin Sisters Tavern, Dungeon Spice, Inn of Shady Retreat, Pixie Dust, Pauper's Watering Bungalow, and the famous Six-Headed Hydra, a tavern known for having 6 front doors, each one with a row of spiky teeth painted on it. This is very odd, noted Thistlethorn. Brox nodded his head in agreement. The gnome's natural inclination was to walk in, find a seat where he could clearly see the fireplace, and make himself at home by ordering some berry budge, a couple of slices of warm bread, and a bowl of strawberry jam or orange marmalade. Nevertheless, he refused to enter because finding an inn at the top of a stairwell connected to a dungeon below was too unusual. After observing this scene for nearly half an hour, Brox spoke. Our hiding here isn't helping our situation. In fact, it may be making it worse, since doing nothing is just burning up time we don't have. He pointed into the room beyond the archway. I propose we go in. We may be walking into a clever trap devised by the Shaden Morgue. Agreed. Brox nodded his head. I say that we still enter but keep our guard up. Having said that, Brox led the way inside. ******. It proved to be a warm, comfortable inn with good food, good conversation, and good music. If anyone had noticed Brox and Thistlethorn entering through the archway that connected to the dungeon, they said nothing about it. This also could have been due to the fact that they had actually sneaked into the inn, dashing behind the main counter when the hired hand that tended it went to fetch a sack of flour. After finishing off as much food as a dwarven fighter would have eaten, they retired to a room upstairs. In their room, a second-story hollow, trimmed in a classical townhouse cut, Thistlethorn moved about, searching for traps that the Shaden Morgue might have left for them, including holes for poison darts, brass bed knobs that discharge lightning bolts, and even magical, but cursed, blankets of suffocation that, after the victim fell asleep, would bind themselves tightly around the slumbering person, trapping them without escape, and suffocating the victim by wrapping several layers around the face. As Thistlethorn continued to move about in his precautionary search, Brox walked over to the window, unlatching the shutter and opening it. There squealed a scratchy shrill as the shutter opened on its rusty hinges. Thistlethorn dropped to the ground thinking that he had triggered a trap. Brox found himself too preoccupied with his task at hand to laugh at Thistlethorn's false alarm. The gnome held in his hand a book so worn from decades of use that all but a few pages had separated from the binding, leaving the book to be bound together by 2 cracked leather strings tied perpendicularly around the cloth cover. Brox did not know the book's age, but his father had once owned a copy, and his grandfather, his great-grandfather, and his great-great-grandfather. Even so, it had been in used condition when his great-great-grandfather had received it. The book was not a printed volume, but a hand-scripted piece of work from a long-forgotten council of gnome elders of the Daylin Meadows. The front covers title said Tailor's Might. What this meant, Brox had no idea. He read the book over a score of times, but he had never read anything about tailors or mites. Much less about a tailor's might. Brox untied the 2 leather strings and gingerly flipped through the pages, smoothing out a crease in one of the pages. Not including its age and hand-scripted nature, the book was different from most other books for 2 major reasons. First, it had not been written in the common language but in the language of the gnomes. Second, the words were not designed to be read but to be hummed. The words had stress marks, hyphens, bold print, and special accents which gave direction on how long to hum the word, when to increase or decrease the pitch, and with what volume to use. Finding the right page, a page that had a monochrome drawing of a nightshade plant growing in the midst of a rock garden, Brox looked over the page for a moment before he began to hum each line one at a time, sometimes quietly and sometimes loudly. As he changed the length of each hum and the pitch, something unusual began to happen in the night air. Although there was no moonlight or starlight to be seen due to the heavy cloud coverage, the land all around the inn began to be illuminated as if lit by a full moon above. Brox could see a dusty trail that stopped in front of the inn, and an abandoned shack next to the trail, its roof having collapsed. On the horizon could be seen a scattering of trees all around, intermingling with bushes, tall hedges, and grasses. He allowed his eyes to follow the trail a bit, until it terminated at a wooden gate. The wooden gate had been shoddily put together, consisting of rotting split rails and rusty hinges. On one side of the gate, Brox saw a board painted with gruesome skulls. From the Canon of Fevers. When Brox saw this, he did not flinch, for he had expected as much. Moreover, he only glanced at the board before letting his gaze continue to the edge of the light. He noted that for the last 20 or so feet, the trees, rocks, ground, etc. all gradually faded out of sight. That was what he sought. He looked for proof that they were not on the major Earth plane proper but on some demiplane that had been ripped off in an ancient experiment of fantastic magical power that had gone awry. Brox closed the shutters and latched them. He knew for the night that they would be safe, but tomorrow, when they went through the wooden gate at the end of the trail, they would have their final encounter.